We sometimes happen to read articles and blog posts that ring true to us. Occasionally, we may even think, hey, the author could be talking about me and my experiences. Well, guess what? I had this sensation when reading an article in TIEonline entitled, My Identity as an International Educator. The article really nailed the character strengths, dispositions, and experiences of individuals who go global to teach. I shared the article with Audrey and said, hey, let's get the author, Sandy Sheppard, on the podcast to help our listeners further build their understanding of what it means to be an international educator. Fortunately, Sandy said yes to our request for an interview. There were many takeaways from our chat with Sandy. One that may not become apparent to many of us until we've been away from home for a while is the extent to which international educators are different. Yes, different. We discussed these differences and how they impacted Sandy when she repatriated to New Zealand and attempted to resume her teaching career back home. If you've tried something similar, you may be able to connect with how she felt about what ensued. Please check the show notes to learn more about Sandy's long overseas career. Now give this episode a listen and then read Sandy's article listed in the show notes to round out your understanding of what it means to be an international educator. This episode was recorded on October 3rd, 2023. We now give you Sandy Sheppard.
Hi, Sandy. Welcome to Educators Going Global. Please tell us where in the world you are.
Currently, I'm in Yangon in Myanmar.
Wonderful. So, Sandy, have you got a going global story for us today?
Sure. When I think about going global, I always think about the very first time I went overseas. And I think for myself, I come from a very small town in New Zealand, and I considered myself a small town country girl. And I was married with 2 small children and wanted to experience something new. So from my small town of 7,000, we challenged ourselves as a family and we took the leap and we moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, a city at that time with 12 million people.
Wow.
So going global for the first time, it was a big change and a big experience. But 27 years on, I've never looked back.
You definitely haven't looked back, and your article really gets into your experiences, and that's what we want to unpack today with our guiding question coming from the article of what does it mean to be an international educator? And as I was rereading that guiding question, it just made me think of how thoughtful and multidimensional this question is, because there's so many facets to being an international educator. And then I was thinking about, well, maybe someone would go, well, we'll just put it in Chat GPT and see what they say. And I was just going to myself, you can't do this. This is too much of the human experience to answer that question. So let's unpack it a little bit. In reading your article, a part of it dealt with your going back to your home country after teaching so many years internationally, and how going back home crystallized your acknowledgement that you were different, and different in a good way. So could you share a little bit about what your experience was going back to New Zealand?
Sure. I think I was very excited to be going home. And part of that was because I felt like I had given so much of myself as an educator to schools around the world. And I wanted an opportunity to give back to my own community in New Zealand as well. So I went back and I really struggled. And I think I was surprised that I really struggled to find a job that I could really fit into. And I did feel very unvalued as an educator. And I think for the first time in my career, that is how I felt. And, it was so surprising. I just didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with that whole feeling of not being valued for what I did. And I had had so many wonderful experiences and taught in some wonderful schools and alongside many different educators. And I felt that I had really grown as an educator, and I felt that I had a lot to offer and that I had something to give back. And then all of a sudden, I had to take a step back and think, okay, almost, but not quite, what's wrong with me? Why am I not being valued for what I know and what I've done?
Mm.
And so I found that really hard. And I think I write in my article, I use the analogy of a box in that article. And I think part of that was a way of expressing my feelings. And the box was how I was able to describe those feelings. And once I was able to sit down and think about it and be able to describe what I was feeling, then I was able to understand better why it was that I didn't fit and that I felt undervalued.
I think to continue on that, the idea that so many international educators develop a toolkit with so many different tools ready to handle so many different situations, probably in a lot of ways much broader than if you stay in your home country, and many cases where you can work at the same school or you stay in the same town. And I've heard similar stories for people going back, and I experienced it too when I went back to the US, that you pull out that toolkit and look at all the different things I can offer. And then the response is, well, we need you to do A, B, C, or XYZ. We really don't need all those different things. So please fit in our system. And that's kind of how it goes sometimes.
I absolutely agree. I actually rewrote my CV at one stage when I was applying for a job because I suddenly realized that what I had written in my CV that I thought was wonderful experiences were not what they were looking for. If I had put that I had been to this conference, for example, in New Zealand, they didn't know what that conference was or how important it was. Where from an international education perspective, that was actually a great place to have been and been part of. Just that lack of understanding, I guess. And I had to try to make that all work for myself, and it was hard.
So I'm just wondering if you did end up teaching in New Zealand or if you sort of packed up right away and left again.
I did some relief teaching and then I worked part-time as a resource teacher as well, which in New Zealand is somebody who works with other teachers to support students.
Right. I'm sure that that experience really will strike a chord with many people who have moved back to their home country and just feel like a square peg in a round hole type of situation because really the types of experiences, and it's interesting because we've worked on the other end of things where people are going international for the first time, and our colleague Jacqueline Millay helps them reshape their resume for going international. And it's so interesting to hear about you reshaping it again to go back home. So I thought that was a very interesting piece about what you just told us about moving back to New Zealand. So let's drill down a little bit on how your work experience might differ. You mentioned the conference and how that is not really a thing that they can fathom in New Zealand, not having been part of those international conference settings. What skills, character strengths of international educators, in your perspective, differ from when you were back in New Zealand?
I think a lot of the character traits are the same and needed by all educators all over the world. I think that is kind of why I thought my experience was going to be transferable, as if I had been teaching in New Zealand. However, I do think as an international educator that we learn a lot of resilience and we're very adaptable, often moving from one educational environment to another. We work with multiple cultural backgrounds, and therefore we learn a lot about cultural sensitivity, and it almost becomes second nature to us as well. Not so much who we're dealing with anymore. It just becomes second nature to what we do. When I was thinking about this, it's almost like children just become children. People just are people, and their cultural backgrounds become less significant. We're able to adapt and understand with a lot more ease from one conversation to another. At least that's kind of how I describe it. And we learn that we can make a difference no matter where we are as well. We're open-minded, we're able to embrace change. We change countries maybe regularly. We might even have a change in leadership more frequently than maybe in our home countries. The community demographics may change more frequently as well. And so we have to deal with a lot of those things maybe a little bit more often. I think that some of those things definitely. I think one of the most empowering things, and I did write about this in the article as well, is that in international schools, often we don't have to deal with an education system as such. So they're not dictating how we do things. So we don't have a Ministry of Education, for example, necessarily. I mean, it differs from country to country, obviously, and some countries do have requirements for international schools as well. But I tend to think we have a lot more freedom about how we do things. And so therefore we can adapt and change and meet our community's needs with a lot more ease than maybe people experience in their home countries when they have to answer to a district, for example.
Yeah, and I think it's also just being aware that how you're thinking may be different from how the people there think. Just that's not necessarily going to even enter the head of someone who's teaching or administrating in their home country because they feel like they already know it. Whereas internationally, you come in as an outsider and you're observing and you're being more mindful of how your perspective meshes with what's going on there. And also the idea of serving a more varied clientele in your students and parents and community and so on. And so I think you're right that international educators just need to be that much more aware of that and be flexible. And because of not having the oversight of a Ministry of Education can be, I'm imagining as you were telling that, I was picturing a canoe versus an ocean liner and how quickly it can pivot and change. But I really loved how you said the more you get out there, the more you discover and come to realize that people are just people and kids are just kids far more than they are from a certain culture or from a certain background. That all fades away and doesn't matter so much. And people are just people. That's also been my experience too. I love that.
No, and I think I found that with my own children as well, who I brought up internationally as well. And I think their ability to connect and communicate, I think, has really added to who they have turned out to be as adults. That ability to just see the world as just an extension of who we are, part of who we are.
So we've had a few interviews with TCKs, cross cultural kids, and you just nailed what they say about their experience. And Audrey, I really appreciate what you were saying there. It's just that self awareness, the metacognition of where am I in this place and time in these surroundings, and how am I interacting? And after a while, yes, you become more fluid in it. But it's just kind of stopping and going, okay, I've got 3 new students. They're from these countries, these cultures. The parents might have these concerns, whatever it is. That is a big part of the job. And just as you were saying, Sandy, the freedom to be creative, to bring in that character strength is such a big part of being an international educator. That is for sure. So this really connects to your point about professional growth, personal growth, like going to conferences and other experiences like that, because in so many schools, PD is a big thing, and a lot of money does go towards that. Could you elaborate a little bit on that for potentially educators who haven't gone overseas yet and they're thinking about? Could you kind of give a lay of the land on professional growth opportunities? And maybe if you want to do some personal growth too, that'd be great.
Well, I think part of the thing that you learn when you're working internationally is that the international community can feel very, very large, but it's actually very, very connected. And I think that, I definitely learned that. It's like you're part of this big world that has international schools in various locations around the world, but we all become very connected through the international community, the organizations out there that are doing such a good job to ensure that connectedness across international schools. And, there are many different organizations. I'm sure you know many of them as well. And people that have worked in international schools will know the organizations I'm referring to, the ones that run big conferences where people from all over the world can come and learn from each other. It's not one group of people, but it's people with various experiences in all sorts of different areas coming together. And once again, it's just that global feeling of connectedness I always find when I'm at one of those conferences. I've been very lucky to work in international schools that value professional growth and development. And like you said, spend a lot of money making sure that that happens, that we don't feel isolated, that we feel part of the international environment. So, yeah, I think listening to podcasts, for example, from international educators. One way to feel very connected, reading articles, like I'm forever seeking information. And I think that's one of the things that I've developed as an international educator is the whole idea that I need to learn from others. And I personally feel very lucky to have had the opportunities that I've had.
And we've got some upcoming podcasts where we bring in regional organization directors. And we've had Laura Light on. She's the, as we say, the ultimate connector, bringing together heads of school and other leaders around the world and these different regional organizations. But I'm so glad you hit on more the kind of personalized learning, whether it be books, articles, podcast, or now all these online courses, these micro courses or full courses that you can take. That is such a part of the culture of international schools for our listeners who are just taking a look at it and saying, what are some benefits?
Yeah, I think that whole idea of growth as an educator is a big part of being part of international schools. At least that's what I've found.
Yeah, I think again, it's the mindfulness and the metacognition. It strikes me that when you're a school in a home country, or I guess I could say public school versus private school, maybe is part of the difference. You kind of rest on your laurels, you've been there forever. There isn't perhaps a sense of a need for growth to the same extent. It's different, isn't it?
And I think when you're international as well, you're part of a global community in this, this ever-changing world we're part of. And you learn very quickly that there's no room for standing still, that you need to be, right up there with current trends because international schools are pushing you forward to be right up there and know exactly what is happening and staying up with the trends and constantly evolving. The school is evolving, you're evolving as an educator. It's this wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's possible too that just by nature, the people who jump into this kind of lifestyle have that growth mindset that are really looking to always seek new opportunities for self-improvement. And then that reflects onto their school community and so on. And then, as you say, when you move from one school to another, already you're thinking, hey, here's an interesting thing that we did at this other school. I think maybe we could apply it to this new situation. So there's a whole lot of learning that goes on organically as well. So perhaps you could share a little bit about how working with international students and their parents influences one's identity as an international educator.
Well, I think the big thing for me is that working with international students and their families, we learn so much about how to understand each other. And we become more than the country we're from. We become part of the whole international experience by working with all these families, these students, the parents. They teach, I mean, definitely they teach me a lot about compassion on a daily basis. You know, a lot of them have very interesting stories that they can tell, and I learn so much about how I need to work to make a difference in people's lives. And that by working with different nationalities that we can really work together to make an impact and make change as well. And when I work with the families at my school, I feel a lot of responsibility to make sure that they're getting the best education possible. I think all educators feel like that, definitely. But when you bring all these different nationalities together, you feel like you have a responsibility to help them learn and understand how they can make a global impact on the world. I think it's part of the role we play as international educators. It's so much bigger than the school we're in. It's more about what impact, because they're going to go out from our school and they're going to impact somewhere else in the world. A teacher is going to move to another international school and make another impact in the world. And it goes on and on and on. And we have this great global influence that we can be making.
Yeah, that's a wonderful comment.
In your article, you mentioned a part of being an international educator is also sometimes dealing with political tensions in the country one is in, and potentially economic crisis and even health crisis like we all went through with the pandemic as potential reasons for change in schools, that they can potentially downsize a school. A school can go through a rough time, in that case, losing students. So we've all been through some of these struggles in various locations in our career. I've had a couple. I was with Audrey in Riyadh. She can share about that, or Ethiopia. But for me, it was Israel in the Gulf War and the missiles coming in every night, and how to be ready, to get yourself grounded to handle things like that to serve your community, but at the same time to make decisions that work right for you. And if you have a family, that comes into play. Audrey, what happened with you in Ethiopia?
So, my first year, there was a civil war going on. And when I first went to the school, my dad said, "What are you doing going there? Don't you know there's a war going on?" And I said, "Oh, but this school has reassured me that it won't really affect the school and that Addis is kind of immune and so on." And then, wouldn't you know, come April, the rebels were marching on the Capitol and we were part of being evacuated because there was a coup happening. And so that was something. And then you alluded to in Riyadh with our episode with Greg Moncada, he talked about the bombing that happened and how that really changed his perspective. And another thing it did was all of a sudden, all the dependents of any military related or paramilitary people were removed from the school. And our school went from around 2,000 kids to around, I think, 800. And that was a huge change. And it involved downsizing of staff and so on. So, yeah, we've been through a couple of these. And now let's hear a bit from Sandy. You were going to mention something that you've been through as well.
Yeah, I was my first international job in Jakarta in Indonesia, and a wonderful experience. Loved the country, great cultural experience. But I was there during the overthrow of President Suharto, and basically, as a country, overnight, things changed. And we were evacuated out of the country as well in the dead of night. And it was a pretty frightening experience, it felt at the time. You certainly learn very quickly how important your embassies are in the countries that you live in, and staying connected to them is very important as well. But yeah, I think when you move internationally, there is always maybe something that you're going to deal with from one country to another. We know international schools that have had to deal with natural disasters or economic issues. I know people that have worked in Venezuela. I know people that were in Nepal when the earthquake happened. So we do have to know that these things happen all over the world as well. I think international communities are very strong communities. And I think that that is always a safe, reassuring thing when you work in an international school community, that you have that strong community to rely on.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, the schools in Ukraine that have moved, they've upstaked and moved to Prague, for example, and kind of reopened school on a temporary basis in a different location. There's also the Anglo-American school in Russia that unfortunately has had to close its doors after 70 years in operation, which is really a sad thing. So certainly these kind of crises have affected schools greatly. So that's one of the risks of being international the way we are. But, despite those difficulties, we continue to love the adventure of international teaching. So it kind of begs the question, and maybe you can tell us how you might answer this question when people who haven't had this experience say, well, what prompts you to keep going back for more?
I've been asked the question why so many times in my international career. Why? Why are you going there? Living in the Middle East, a lot of people ask me questions about why would you go to the Middle East? It can be questions about, isn't it too hot there? What about the culture there? Exactly. I think part of it is we develop a lot of resilience over time, um, definitely. So you become very strong, maybe a little bit more open minded about how you're going to manage these things as well. You love adventure. So, along with those things comes a lot of adventure as well. You become a risk taker, a lot more willing to look at things with less of worry in your mind, but rather I'll give it a go. Like I'll see what happens.
So I'm going to connect that to what you were just saying a moment ago in the rough times. And now here we're talking about the good times. And one of the connectors is community. And it reminded me of being in Hong Kong during SARS. And we went virtual. Our elementary school, it was a big deal. And I wrote an article about it afterwards. And the organization I was writing for was asking for all these technical things that we did. And I offered what we had. But I said the most important thing we did was we brought everyone together because they depended upon that school. They wanted to hear from our leadership. They needed that guidance. And there's such a feeling of trust, right? You trust that these children, just in regular times, you're dropping them off every day. And so then when you're isolated in your house, your apartment, out of fear of illness, that was a big deal and really hit home for me, the power of community. And then on the flip side, as you're saying, so much of your experience as an international educator is around your school on the weekends if you've got children going out to events. And then as you maybe become a little less of a expatriate, maybe a little less in the school bubble, you start venturing out, as you were saying, the travel experiences locally in the country and then internationally are just such cherries on the top of the cake. It's wonderful and it's something we keep coming back to.
I think you become each other's family, right, in an international school environment. I always, in a leadership role, which I have, you have to wear many different hats. And I say, I'm not just an educator, I'm also a counselor, I'm a sister, I'm a mother. And now at the age I am, I'm often play grandmother as well.
That is definitely the case as we progress in life in general and as international educators. So, as we progress towards the end of our chat with you, which has just been wonderful, so much wisdom you're sharing, Sandy. Thank you. I'm wondering, is there anything else you want to share? And If you are out there on LinkedIn or Instagram or some way that people could follow you, because your article, which is in TIE, we'll have the link, is just such a fabulous read.
I just think that I feel much more settled as a educator now that I have come to the realization that this is what I do and this is who I am. And I think that a lot of us maybe ask the question when we go international, when should we go home? When is the right time to go home? I work with teachers all the time that are like, oh, well, should we take our children back now? Should they do school in our home country? Have I been away too long? Am I going to get a job? And I asked myself that question for a lot of years. And 27 years later, when I did go home, I realized that I had made a career choice somewhere along the way. And the career choice I had made was to be an international educator. And it has become part of who I am and my identity. And I feel much calmer now as a person knowing those things about myself. And yes, I'm on LinkedIn and I'm more than happy to connect with people and for people to follow me. I'm just there, found under Sandy Sheppard. And I'm also on Instagram as well. Also happy for people to follow me. And on Instagram, I can be found under Sandy Lee Sheppard, Lee being my middle name.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to echo what David said about your article. I really enjoyed it. It was very well written and it was from the heart. And I think that both aspiring and veteran educators would gain something from reading it. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And we've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again for being here today.
And best wishes for the rest of the school year.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.